has a straight edge on it, so it's very easy. And maybe in our world here, there lives a happy little mountain.
Hello everyone, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Caitlin. I upload a whole bunch of different types of videos on this channel, and today I'm bringing back one of the videos that I kind of introduced last week. It was a kind of, this isn't technically a psychological experiment, but basically I wanted to start sort of discussing different experiments that have happened over time, sort of more controversial ones. So last week I talked about the Stanford prison experiment, and today I'm back with one that I personally had never actually heard of until I came across it in some research, and I think maybe one of you guys might have actually mentioned it to me. But yeah, I'd never heard of it before, so you guys might have. It might be really like commonly known, I just don't know of it. So yes, today we're going to be discussing the whole situation around something called the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment. They were a very controversial experiment that ran on for about 50 years before anyone realised what they were doing, and before it was shut down, basically, before it was terminated. So I'm going to sort of talk about why it was controversial, what happened, because reading this, like, it's absolutely awful. When I was researching it, I just fully felt for all those people, all the families of the participants involved in this. So it's quite an upsetting experiment, but I'm going to discuss it with you today. So if you want to hear a little bit about it, then keep on watching. Okay, so like I said, this experiment ran for around 50 years before it was terminated. So it ran from the year of 1932 to 1972. It was ran by the US Public Health Service, and what we can only assume is kind of the main aim of this study was to determine some sort of cure for syphilis, because when the experiment started there was no known cure for syphilis. So I'm not going to go into detail about what syphilis is, but you can look up the actual definition, which I don't have on me. Syphilis is something that it basically has quite extreme consequences if it's not treated. So I think it can be sexually transmitted, but then it can also be passed on if it's untreated to children. If you give birth, I mean not to children, but if you have children and you have syphilis with it untreated, then you can pass it on to them. It can lead to death in some cases, it can lead to blindness. Some people have psychotic episodes with untreated syphilis, so it's a very, very extremely not very nice disease to have, illness to have. So yes, at that time there was no known cure for syphilis. So experimenters at this time had wanted to advertise for participants to take part in the study, and in order to do so, what they chose to do is they chose to get some volunteers. So they advertised for volunteers who, if they enrolled in the study, they would receive free healthcare throughout the duration of the experiment. Now this was a huge deal, like this was a big opportunity for a lot of people. They only wanted African American, usually sort of working class participants, because they wanted people that didn't have access to healthcare already. Obviously in the US they would have had to pay for healthcare, so a lot of them ended up being like farm hands and things like that, so they hadn't really. So by advertising this free medical care, they got so many participants to come forward, because like I said, it was just such an unusual thing to be offered free healthcare at this time. A total of 600 men enrolled to take part in this study, and the majority of them had never actually been to a doctor before. When the experimenters had gotten their 600 participants enrolling in this study, they split them into groups. So they hadn't specified that they only wanted people suffering with syphilis. They wanted just anyone that fit those criteria that I previously mentioned. So when they got kind of their total participant number, which was 600, they split them into groups of people who had syphilis and who didn't have syphilis.
Syphilis was considered a national health crisis in the early 20th century.
You don't know a thing about syphilis, except that you've got it.
And many doctors at the time thought syphilis and other medical complications were affected by race. To study the disease, researchers found a population of poor, black, syphilitic sharecroppers in and around Tuskegee, Alabama during the Great Depression. Nearly 400 of the participants had syphilis, while another 200, the control group, did not.
So a total of 399 had latent syphilis, and then the remainder 201 of their participants did not have syphilis. Because of the nature of the experiment, they didn't want to tell the participants the actual sort of true nature, what they were truly aiming for in this experiment. It happens a lot because as much as you need to sort of inform the participants of what needs to happen, a lot of people require they want to see the natural progression of certain things within their experiment, so if they tell the participants, it can affect that. So in this case, wrongly, just point out, but I will go into why it was so bad sort of towards the end of the video. They didn't tell the participants in this case what they were studying, and this had serious effects on the participants' lives. So the experimenters had obviously advertised for these participants, and they had told them when they were taking part in the study that throughout sort of the duration of the study they would be treating them for a term called bad blood, which is basically just like a more generic term used to sort of describe any sort of basically it's just a general term for any ailment, any illness, any symptoms of anything. So basically they were saying that you will take part in the study and all we need you to do is come to us whenever you are ill, whenever there is some sort of symptom or ailment bothering you, we will treat it and we will make a note of it, and that is the purpose of the study. And the experimenters also managed to get any sort of local healthcare workers, any physicians on board with this study. So they basically said, if any of these men come to you looking for any treatments for any of their illnesses, any of their symptoms, don't give it to them because we are giving it to them and we don't want it to interfere with the study. And surprisingly, it wouldn't really happen now, but all those healthcare professionals at that time did agree to this. So like I said, it seemed as though they kind of gave the impression as though they just wanted to have these regular checkups with the participants and to make note of any sort of progression of any illnesses, whatever was kind of bothering them, and they would treat them and then send them on their way until the next time they needed to come in and be treated for something. But in actual fact, the thing that was wrong with this study, basically, as you can imagine, is quite awful. They weren't actually treating any of these participants, and I mean any of them, with anything. So if a participant had come to them with any sort of ailment, they would have simply given them placebos, they would have given them mineral supplements, as though they were actual medication. So they were lying to these participants, saying that they were treating whatever illness or whatever ailment they had when they actually weren't. So now you have to imagine, this may not seem as big of a deal for sort of slightly smaller ailments and illnesses and things, but as they'd set out knowingly with such a high amount of sufferers of syphilis, people with syphilis in their study, they were choosing not to treat this disease. One of the most common placebos they used, they would give them aspirin and tell them it was a drug treated like just medicine for whatever ailment there was. So obviously this aspirin wasn't going to do anything, hence it being a placebo. And then sort of midway through the study, or a couple of years into the study, it was in 1947, it was publicly released that it was like just public knowledge that the best treatment or the best cure for any syphilis sufferers was penicillin. Despite knowing this, they chose to continue with the placebo. They didn't give them any penicillin, and basically what we can only assume is the actual aim of the study is that they had intended to just see out the course of syphilis, the illness. So they continued this course of action through all of the participants with the worst symptoms and the worst outcomes. So like I said, with things like syphilis, there are some extreme like kind of onset symptoms like blindness. So a lot of participants went blind. There were some that had psychotic episodes. Some people died. They just saw this through, which is dreadful. And I actually, I'm stuttering now because I genuinely can't believe this was something that was carried out. So basically, these experimenters were knowingly preventing the treatment of these illnesses that these participants were having, but all the participants were under the impression that they were being treated for them. This, of course, is highly unethical, and it's something that wouldn't happen today, because they were knowingly choosing to watch these participants sort of virtually, most of them, die a slow and an agonising death. And they lived out 50 years of their life with this pain because they were believing that they were being treated for it, which I just think is absolutely awful. It's just such an awful thought. There was a man named Peter Buxton, and he was, I think, was a specialist in like venereal diseases, and it was brought to his attention by a friend of his about the true nature of this study, and this is sort of when it all kicked off. So yeah, like I said, he'd heard about the true nature of this experiment, and he obviously knew that it was something that shouldn't be happening, and it was kind of just shocking to him why it was happening. I don't understand how this came about. So he took it upon himself as a professional to sort of voice his concerns and make it a little bit more public, make some complaints about the nature of this study, how they're carrying it out and how it shouldn't be happening this way. If they want to study the course of syphilis, they need to do it another way, because this is just highly unethical when these participants aren't aware it's going on. Because he's made his complaints, it wasn't too public. He kind of made it to the US Public Health Service. In response, the Public Health Service said that they were going to form like this committee to sort of discuss the nature, like the future of the experiment, whether they were going to allow it to continue or not, because they wanted to assess sort of all the risks and everything, like, you know, as a response to his complaint. But surprisingly, it was decided that the experiment would continue, and this was despite knowing the fact that experimenters like openly said during this committee that their intention was to see out the course of syphilis. So they were intending to see out all of the participants into their deaths, because then they could examine each of the participants through post-mortem. It means they could get more detailed data and analyse it all. So their intention was to see every single one of those 600 participants through to their death. So what I can only imagine from this is sort of the intention was to then compare the results of like post-mortems from those participants that were suffering with syphilis in their lifetime and then those who were not. And that is absolutely dreadful. Not only just that was the intention openly said, but also that the committee then ultimately decided to let it continue. So as you can imagine, Peter Buxton was not happy after hearing about this committee's decision, so he then took it upon himself. He was kind of a bit like, if they aren't going to shut this down, I'm going to do everything that I can to get it terminated. So he decided to leak the information, the true nature of this study, to a reporter friend of his, who then told a colleague of his working at a newspaper. And then in 1972, a newspaper called Associated Press released the true intentions of the study, all of the details that he was made aware of, and everything became public knowledge.
How old were you when you first learned about the Tuskegee study?
23.
The day you published this story, the day the story was published, did you know what was getting ready to happen?
Yeah. I knew it would be explosive. After the story broke, and there was this incredible public outcry, Senator Kennedy had held very, very public congressional hearings on this.
If they had been white, your public health service would never have agreed to do this study in the first place. They wouldn't have dared.
As you can imagine, there was widespread public outrage at not only the fact that they were lying to them, but also that was their intention ever from the start, which is, you know, I share that outrage. I don't understand how that ever got past like the planning stage. However, like I said, this was released in 1972, and it was ultimately terminated because of the extreme public outcry that came about after the release of this information. But the study had already been running for 50 years. It had already been active 50 years prior, meaning that so many participants had seen through their entire lives, or the most of their lives, with these illnesses being untreated. So I kind of have the final statistics here of the participants after this study. So by that time it was terminated in 1972-73. A total of 28 participants had actually died from syphilis, and then around 100 more had died from onset kind of symptoms and ailments. I don't know if that 100 is syphilis sufferers and non-syphilis sufferers, but 100 more approximately died as a result of other sort of illnesses and ailments. On top of that, a total of around 40 spouses and partners of participants in that study were then diagnosed with syphilis, because like I said, you can pass on syphilis and if it's left untreated, and obviously they didn't know it was being untreated, so they unknowingly passed on this illness to their spouses, and as a result, unfortunately, which just makes it even more heartbreaking, the disease was actually then passed on to nearly 20 children. So nearly 20 children were born with this illness because neither of the parents were aware that they had it still, because, like I said, to their knowledge, they were being treated for it. So like I said, as you can imagine, there was this huge outcry, and a lot of anger was turned towards the US Public Health Service, as you can imagine, because they were the ones that were running this study. They were the ones that were sort of in charge of it, and I think it was like a year later, there was like a $10 million payout that was paid to any remaining participants of the study, any surviving ones, and also any of the heirs and the spouses to any of those who had died as a result of the study. So in some ways there was some compensation, but for the amount of people that died, there is no monetary value to losing someone you love, so unfortunately a lawsuit can only really do so much in that case. These experimenters willingly allowed the deaths of so many people, and you can't really put a price on that. So one of the good things that did come as a result of this experiment was that the guidelines around experiments and people's sort of public health and things like that they did have to be checked. So ethical guidelines became so much more strict, and like to this day, if you wanted to carry out a research study, psychological experiment, anything, you have to follow some very, very strict guidelines for purposes like this, to avoid situations like this experiment, because not only do you have to fully inform the participants of what they will be expected, so you don't necessarily, there are ways around it, so you don't necessarily have to tell them the exact what you're looking at in the study, but anything that will be expected of them, anything that will affect them as a person, you have to inform them of, because they then have to give their consent. So if they aren't fully informed, they shouldn't give their consent, otherwise it's unethical. They should also be allowed to withdraw themselves, but obviously none of these participants thought they needed to. And also you are supposed to be protecting the participants from any physiological or psychological harm that may come to them as a result of this study, and this is obviously the biggest thing they did not do in this study. It was actually in 2004 that the final remaining or surviving participant of the Tuskegee Syphilis Experiment, he died. His name was Herman Shaw. He died at the age of 95, and he kind of lived on his life telling the story of what had happened in this study, and he did a lot for sort of fighting human rights. And if you go online, there are clips of him talking at the White House and things. So yes, unfortunately, he did die in 2004, but he lived a full life to the age of 95. So then in 2010, another experiment came to light that did only run for a year, but it still broke very similar guidelines, all these ethical guidelines. And it's, again, one of the ones that I can't believe was even allowed to happen, but I explain a little bit as to how this was allowed to happen. So the experiment took place between the years of 1946 and 1948, and actually was an experiment that was carried out in Guatemala. So the overall intention, the aim of this study when they set out to begin it, was to determine whether penicillin, like I said, by this point it was widely acknowledged that penicillin could be used to treat syphilis, but this study aimed to investigate whether penicillin had the ability to prevent someone from getting syphilis or an STD, rather than just treating it or treating its symptoms post receiving it or getting it. So yeah, basically, long story short, it's again absolutely dreadful, so it's not really the nicest thing to talk about, but the experimenters of this particular study knowingly infected around 700 people with syphilis and other STDs in hopes of sort of examining penicillin's effects on whether or not it would prevent them getting these STDs that they were infecting them with intentionally. These 700 participants, there were so many different types of people in this participant list. There were military personnel, there were mental patients, families, there were prisoners, there were so many people in this participant list that, like I said, were intentionally infected with some sort of sexually transmitted disease without their knowledge. And not only this, but not all of the participants were then given subsequent medical treatment for the disease that they were infected with, because, like I said, they wanted to sort of examine the effects of penicillin. So this is absolutely dreadful, and like I said, this did only go on for 1 year to 2 years, so it was shut down a lot quicker, but this was an experiment that wasn't necessarily granted the ability to begin, because there were no official public records of this study ever existed. There was a man named Dr. John Cutler. He was a researcher within the US Public Health Service. He was the one that was actually in charge of this study. He ran it, and so he didn't make any sort of public records of carrying out this experiment. It was something that he kind of did on his own. There were other US government officials that knew of this study, but it was kind of a little bit hush-hush, hence why it was allowed to continue for 2 years. But then when he died in 2003, I think it was someone that was clearing out his office, stumbled across these records and obviously alerted the attention of some quite high-up government officials, and it came to light what he'd been doing. And obviously I think there was a lot of kind of press conferences in 2010. I think Obama even went on record and apologised, and it was all sort of this like big apology because not many people knew it was happening. And it was outrageous. Obviously, I'm sure you guys will agree with me that it was outrageous that this was allowed to happen. And in all honesty, it didn't really bring anything that substantial. There were no new sort of developments that were that substantial to allow 700 people to be exposed to a number of different STDs. So they were the two sort of experiments I'm going to discuss today. Mainly, basically, the outcome of this is just to stress the importance of ethical guidelines. So I know if you're someone like me who studies psychology and a lot of other things as well, but psychology ethical guidelines are a huge deal. They're really, really stressed on you, and this is a prime example as to why they are drilled into us as students, budding psychologists, because these things shouldn't be allowed to happen. And it baffles me, like reading this and trying to explain it all to you guys. You can see probably at points in this I'm a little bit lost for words because it just doesn't seem like something that should have actually happened. So yeah, that's everything I'm going to discuss today. Let me know your thoughts down below. If there are any other like experiments or something that you've heard about that you want to let me know about in the comments, or if there's one you want me to do a video on, then feel free to leave anything in the comments. If you like this sort of content, then definitely subscribe to my channel and turn on your post notifications so you know whenever I upload a new video. And I hope you found this interesting. I will see you guys soon for another video. Bye!